I hope you enjoyed the first half of this conversation. This portion is the live technical interview with our guest. Feel free to follow along and create a solution of your own.
So I interview a little differently in such a sense that, first of all, tell me what is your biggest failure?
Ooh, my biggest failure.
Yeah. Technical failure, call it that, or failure. Either.
I would say technical failure. I have a app that I have talked about a lot. We may have talked about it earlier on. This is texting app that I built that sends out kind of scheduled reminder text. And I was interviewing pretty heavily, and that's a thing that got brought up quite often. And I realized at a certain point, this doesn't actually run. The live version doesn't actually run. To this day, it doesn't actually run because I haven't had time to go back and fix it. But I interviewed for probably a solid month where I was telling people, you can go check this out. It's live. And then I would check the logs the next day just to make sure they didn't actually go make an account because it just wouldn't function correctly. And I still don't know exactly what the issue is, which is why I would say it's currently my largest technical failure.
And is this code on your computer right now?
It is. So it runs on my local machine. I believe it is a database issue in Heroku. I'm hosting it.
Okay. Tell me more about this thing. Can we see it?
Yeah, let me see if I can pull it up. So it's an app called Reach Out that I built. Personal. Reach Out. You can tell how long it's been since I've.
Because we were talking about the poker sorter as well.
Poker sorter.
Yeah. But you said Reach Out.
I don't know where it lives now.
Is it Retask? No.
I can pull it up on GitHub pretty easily.
All right, let's do that. Clone away if necessary.
Let's see. Okay, so the project itself, this is why I say it's a Frankenstein. When I built it, I wasn't aware that you shouldn't necessarily put your front end and your back end in your same project. So that's also interesting.
Depends what year you decided to build it in.
Yeah. So as it runs, right now, website does work.
That's good.
Let's see. Probably needs to be logged in too. But the actual text, so it uses Twilio to schedule reach outs to individuals, and it should send a text based off this frequency. So let's say it's a daily frequency, sending a message to myself, which is a contact that was already created. This is a random thing that will follow up about a specific thing. We say the start date is today. So if I hit the create reach out button, it does work. And my phone's on, I will get a message saying, we'll send you a message every day to reach out to this person. That follow-up message never comes.
Oh, that message never comes?
Yes.
Oh. Why not? Why do you think it is?
I believe it is some issue with Heroku potentially, or it's with the cron job. So the way that I run it now is a Rails back, and I'm trying to remember where it lives. Probably in the controllers. No, that one doesn't do anything. There. The way that it runs right now is that it's supposed to use this thing called Rufo, which is basically doing cron jobs in Ruby, or a type of cron job. But it doesn't. I don't think it actually will follow up. So it looks something like this. Basically, the message using Twilio will send. I think it's actually in my view.
It's hard coded.
Let's see. Reach outs. No, it's not going to be in my view. Where would that live?
And just so you know, you're teaching me a ton of stuff here as well. Like, I mean, I understand everything I'm looking at, of course, but I don't know how the structure of how this thing's set up. But I'm also making you debug your own code.
Yes.
Which is really annoying.
Yeah. So it'd be a reach out API reach out controller. So each reach out gets created. That's a process I just did, right? Which did send me a text correctly. A new reach out's created with all these different params, right? And this is Ruby code. And so we fed all of those in. And if it saves, which it did, we know that because it sent this message basically saying this, which is what I just got. What should happen is this line, which is Rufus will send a scheduled, basically a reminder text based on the frequency. So every reach out frequency, which is something we pass in, it should do this, which is send another follow-up message, which does work when I'm running it on localhost. And basically I leave my Ruby server running for 2 days and I have it set frequency. It'll send every day. If I have it hosted on Heroku, which is what this app that's out in the wild is hosted on, it doesn't do that at all. And then the logs don't show that there's any issues necessarily. So that's been the difficult part of debugging it too, is there's no clear like error, our database isn't processing this, or this is full or something, right?
Yeah. So what, let's see here, I want to ask this question. Being that this runs in it, like, have you researched into how, and I'm not as familiar with Heroku as far as the hosting platform goes. Is this basically like a Nginx or an Apache server that's hosting it? I cannot remember who makes it.
I think it's a Postgres server or Postgres database.
It doesn't seem like it's your database. If anything, what it seems like is, here's an issue we run into in the .NET world, at least in IIS. There's what they call the idle time shutdown. And so in IIS and stuff like that, and it's kind of funny because the bug you're dealing with is the one that actually is one of my most famous ones as well for causing problems, was that after 20 minutes of no requests and stuff like that to provision, like basically to do resource leveling and stuff like that, a lot of web servers will basically shut down the listener for the process, or shut down the hosting process and keep the listener open. And so what happens is the executable that's running, that's running Ruby or whatever, shuts down, and that scheduler basically shuts down, so it's never restarted. And then so as you basically kept pinging this thing and letting, this URL for a while and kept running, basically a test just hit the URL every 10 minutes or something, or 5 minutes, you may see that it stays alive. And the reason is because, and a lot of people do this because they look at the same like local development versus actually deploying it out to the cloud or to a web provider or something like that, is that, again, it shuts down those process shut down. And again, I don't know if Ruby does. I'm not sure if Ruby does that part, but I know a lot of the web hosts do. So that would probably be why. It's because now a lot of people have run into this problem over the years. This was probably my first big screw up ever, was because of doing the same thing and learning that these processes shut down. Where I sent out, what was it? 250,000 emails in 10 minutes through Caterpillar servers because I did it the same way. A buddy of mine got a promotion because of it, because she was able to send out that many emails, but they're all to like 9,000 people. It was horrible. And it's not even the first time I've done that. My second time I took down BlackBerry because of the same mistake. But that's something you may want to look at.
Interesting. So since this is something that's hosted, and what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, because I'm on, I think it's called the hobby dev plan, right? And basically I get charged per uptime, or something similar to that. I'm assuming it shuts down fairly often, to try to keep that as low as possible. So it's makes a lot of sense to me that basically that Rufo's scheduler, which only will run if it's is only initialized and then has to stay active, right? For it to actually trigger, won't trigger because basically that Ruby has shut down. That's interesting. I haven't even thought of that.
And that's just because the way like multi-threading works and stuff like that within these systems is that it's only looking at one thing. It doesn't, IIS kind of considers it to be improper for you to be running those inside the application, because it's not really the way it's supposed to be done. Right. But a lot of people do, because when you're developing locally, it makes sense. It doesn't translate over well. So like, that's why when you mentioned kind of what your problem was, I'm like, all right, let's see if we can actually debug this a little bit. I want to see what you can kind of get out of it. But I'd be interested to see if you get to try that, because that'd be one of those things that does happen a lot. And once you deal with it the first time, you'll solve so many more problems now than you did before. You're just like, oh, did I do that again? But yeah, it'd be something to look at there. Everything else CI here is pretty good. Like, I would rather look at something you've done and did some actual work with. And this is pretty cool. I've never looked at Ruby that much, other than a few things. What do you like about it?
There's a thing called Rails magic, or I think specifically Rails with Ruby. Sometimes it does just feel very easy to make all of the data you need just show up where you want it to be, which I think it's very useful because it's the first language I learned, right? And I think syntactically it is a little bit clearer. This def show, right? Like it's pretty straightforward. You don't have any brackets. You don't really have anything around that. I think when I was first learning, my dad said, "Isn't coding like crazy difficult?" And I was like, "I think you could tell me what this does, right? Like this statement." I think I sent him a little if-else statement. I was like, "You could break this down, right? Like it may not make sense to you what that code's actually going to do, but you understand roughly what this looks like." So I think it reads very easy, and then just because it's easy that Rails magic sometimes makes it very easy to get the basics built, especially since I've mostly focused on front end. It allows me to build something that's fairly complicated from a back end perspective without having actually something like Java, which would probably take me a lot longer or even C#, right, to get up and running with the same type of application. Would be able to build that in Rails much quicker.
It kind of reminds me of like PHP, what they were doing with it, except for cleaner and probably a little bit more secure, I'm sure. And even Cold Fusion a little bit.
I tell people in Chicago, Ruby ate the PHP market. Like there's not a ton of PHP in Chicago, and obviously, Ruby is pretty large here. And I think really it's taken over that market, where in New York, you might not see very much Ruby or Rails at all, and you see a lot more PHP, right?
Yeah, but I think like what I was seeing is that this is definitely like this is pretty cool. Like I said, I've never really gotten to look at Ruby that much. And this is insanely readable, especially from like a UI perspective. Are you using like Fast API or anything like that behind, or have you heard of Fast API?
I've heard of it, but I'm not using that. And really,
Okay.
it's Twilio. I have a couple APIs to pull like those news articles and those jokes. That's it for the most part as far as APIs.
Have you done anything with like synchronous calls, like Ajax calls and stuff like that, through like say React or jQuery or any of those
Yeah,
libraries?
on the front end, it's just using Vue, and it does quite a bit of
Okay.
various different calls. Let's see if I can pull it up. Vue's similar to Rails in the sense that I feel like it was very easy to route data around in a way that made a lot of sense. See if I can pull up the.
Do you know what the architectural principle is behind it? What it's called?
No.
That's fine. Sometimes we call them an MVVM framework or model view model.
Oh, yes.
So yeah, okay. That's what Vue, because you'll hear MVC, MVVM, MVP, and you don't have to necessarily, like, a lot of times they're interchanged. Sometimes they're used together. And neither wrong is wrong or right, and they've been around since the 70s.
Yeah.
But people think they're invented in the 90s.
Okay. Yeah, definitely be MVC focused. So I was using Axios mostly for my calls, and then making a handful of them. I think I just found Axios rather than using something else, just because it seems straightforward. I think someone recommended it to me.
It was the first thing that came up and you Googled it.
Yeah.
And had code that worked. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's how I pulled a lot of this data around, especially the stuff I was pulling, which wasn't bad.
This is all JavaScript with Vue, right? Yeah.
So the nice part with JavaScript or with Vue is like a lot of this is just pure JavaScript, right? The Vue itself, it's something that it's not that complicated. Like there's some Vue specific stuff like these Vue 4s, right? Like those were, and then like VIFs, like those are something you have to pick up. But I think if you understand React, Vue is very easy. You'll be like, oh, it's almost exactly the same, right? It's just as far as like how you think about it. And then if you understand JavaScript, it's just putting on a little bit more of a framework, right?
Yeah, it's kind of, so it's interesting that you showed like, the VF and stuff like that, which is what they call unobtrusive Ajax or whatever it is, or unobtrusive JavaScript. What do you think about using those like Angular uses it, React uses it, Vue and everyone else? How do you like using that versus, let's say, the more direct way of functions, finding your elements and stuff like that within the DOM instead?
Yeah, I would do. I don't think I'd have a job if I said this, but I would do everything in vanilla JavaScript if I could. Like, I think I really like working with it, even though I know, it does get complicated. And if I'm saying like these things are all great because they're very readable and like it makes sense. I would say vanilla JavaScript's the opposite of that sometimes, right? Where you're like, I have to write this much code to make one thing happen, right? Versus you can type a pretty short line. But I do feel like at its base, like that's what all these frameworks are based on, and they're all just doing that in a simpler way, right? So I tried to pick up a lot of vanilla JavaScript when I was learning Vue at the same time. So I was like, at least I know how to do it quickly if I need to in Vue, but then I have a little bit of a better understanding under the hood in vanilla JavaScript. So something that I tried to do for a while was anything I built in Vue, then go back and build in a vanilla JavaScript too, which is difficult at times and I think took a long time, but I felt like that was very helpful for just actually understanding the language instead of being a React expert or a Vue expert, which may or may not be here in 5 years. JavaScript will still be there, right? And you still kind of understand how that works. So I like it. I would prefer it. And even now, the work I'm doing professionally, there's some jQuery stuff that I'm like, can we rewrite this in Java, like vanilla JavaScript? Like it may be a little bit more, may just need a few more lines to do this, but I think at the end of the day, like it might actually make more sense in the long run, right?
Gotcha. And sometimes that is a better solution. Like we try to square peg and round hole things. It's like, oh, this does 99% of what I want to do. You know, I can deal with that 1%. Yeah, it's interesting to see, like, because again, the React Vue, whatever. Sorry, my dog. All those other frameworks out there, all JavaScript in the end, or even enhancements on top of jQuery and stuff like that. And it's just like a lot of prototypes and automation on top of it, which is really cool. But yeah, at the same time, it's just really good to know how it works as well. It's good stuff, though. I'll be honest with you. Like it's clean looking. At least you use like tabs. It drives me nuts when I don't see that. Like when people don't like space their code. I know it sounds silly, but like have to be kind of clean. You use valuable, like real method names and stuff like that makes sense, instead of like V1 or just like method 1 or whatever, something silly.
I have to stop myself at work now when I see just a variable or a function that's just really, to me, looks like really poorly named, and I'm like, is it worth probably spending an hour just going through and fixing this all and making sure everything works correctly? Probably not. But if the next person who stumbles across this doesn't have to spend 15 minutes trying to figure out what this thing does because it's named switch function, might be helpful.
Yeah, because there's times where I'm guilty of it too, where you like 2 a.m. you're writing a method, you're like, I'm just going to call it rabbit eats lettuce. Someone else can deal with it. So, are you liking it so far, being in the professional software world?
Yeah, it's great. I think, a recruiter asked me the other day, he goes, why'd you switch? And I said, I just wanted to use my brain more than I was in recruiting. And I realized after the fact, maybe not the best thing to say to a current recruiter, but
just using it differently.
It's just a different type of work where I felt recruiting is almost, I would say, like manual data entry to a certain extent, with the occasional conversation, right, with someone. And that part's interesting. The people are interesting. But even after a certain scale, you're having the same types of conversations constantly, right? So after 6 years of doing it, it was talking to not the same person over and over again, but roughly having the same conversation with different people, every day, X number of hours a day. So this is a lot more interesting, even if it's much more challenging at times.
Right on, man. I'm excited for you. It's cool. Like I actually kind of wanted to go the other direction, eventually go to recruiting, just because I could take the experience and like, hey, I know you're BSing me on this, and then, but now the way you talk about it, that's not going to happen at all.
I do think there's a possibility to do some amount of consulting, but what I think the difficulty is in recruiting is there's just no. Recruiting companies are cheap at the end of the day, and most large companies always are trying to reinvent the wheel. So if you're building anything, like if you're trying to be a consultant to a recruiting company, there's just not that much of a market, because they just want to, it's bottom dollar for them. And then if you're trying to work with companies internally, like maybe it's there, but I feel like everyone kind of has their own opinion on like, this is how we do it. And trying to get them to change can be really difficult.
That is. I agree there. I don't know. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to ask you. Because the big thing, like when it comes to like technical interviews, for me to kind of follow this up is like the fact that you'd mentioned you had your own code out there that didn't work. I was like, this is perfect. Because now I can make you go back and like look at your own stuff and explain it, as well as kind of understand why something's happening and whether or not you debugged it in the end. You're able to talk through and show me like, hey, this is where the exact problem is, or what seems to be the problem. And now you have the ability to kind of go out there and test it and stuff like that. And the key moment, I guess, like a hiring decision for me would be like, if you like texted me back or something like, by the way, I tried it out and it worked. If I put a ping on it for something like that. Yeah. For me, that would be like the hiring moment and saying, okay, they took something, they learned, they didn't have to do anything out of it. You didn't have to do anything out of this whatsoever, but you took an opportunity to learn whether or not you got a job out of it or not, or you had, whether or not it was on the table, you could still that reaching out and saying, man, I took that advice, looked at it, and hey, it worked or it didn't work. And either way, it to me as a hiring manager is like, okay, that's someone that's still trying to constantly thrive to learn and improve and on their own stuff and stuff like that. And plus, I think that's actually what your problem is.
Yeah, this is the Rufus cron job stuff is probably the piece of this that I understand the least as well. Like I got it to the point where I was like, I know this works. Now I'm done. Right. And then moved on to like actually making it do other things. So that's something I think I could also just spend more time on understanding better because well, especially, I mean, cron jobs
weird.
Yeah. I feel like it's something that could probably be really useful when you spoke early on about like, being lazy and trying to automate things. Like that's something that could probably be hugely useful if I actually dug into it more versus just thinking, that's a problem I'll get to eventually. Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way to put it. True. Yeah, I'm curious. Like I said, I'm curious now. I'm trying to think if there's any questions I got for you. Like I said, I do my interviews a little differently, in which case that I'm testing your knowledge by showing me like what you've done and how you learn and how you think and how you walk through a problem, which the way you walk me through code and stuff like that and so on. I mean, for me, I'd definitely advance you if it makes you feel better. I'm not hiring right now, but hey,
I'll take that.
You go the next round. So,
when you mentioned following up, saying, if someone said like message you later and said, hey, I figured that out, right? I think a lot of people always feel weird about that, right? Sending a thank you letter, I think is something people say do that, which like, I don't know how much that actually means to someone, but I think something like this makes a lot more sense. Being able to say, hey, that thing we spoke about that maybe I didn't understand 100%, I went and tried something and, here's the result, right?
Right, it's relatable.
Yeah. You think that might be something that, you would advise and might be universal as well, or at least
totally
better more often than not?
Yeah, because like for me, even like I said, is this like as a developer as well, I'd be kind of curious, and it'd even be something like kind of like a little mini story to myself, like, oh yeah, that guy did call me back after that, and that was just kind of like just a moment, of or phenomena, whatever you want to call it, something that stands out to you. Yeah, it's gonna whether or not it becomes like a job later on or something like that. That's still kind of one of those moments in life that stands out that people remember. And I've learned that pays itself back in weird ways, like sometimes many, many years later.
Yeah.
And so, it can't hurt. And the more people we know, plus, like I said, it's like, we like to know this kind of stuff.
And like you were saying earlier too, even if it puts you like one notch above, right? If the average is here and you're that person who followed up, it's like, all right, well, toss that person. Like maybe you have your top three and then you're like, oh, we'll toss that person into the next round too, because they followed up. Right.
Right.
And sometimes that little difference is the difference between you getting a job and not. Right.
Totally. It could be like, I got these two. This guy said he followed up with something. Yep. Good. That's the deciding factor, Yeah. Just that little edge of that 2-second email,
Maybe my recruiter advice, if anyone who's a recruiter listening to this, I have always followed up after I interviewed with the manager, usually an engineering manager, who says like, this is my hardest role. I typically ask, like, what are you trying to fill in the next 3 months, right? They go, oh, this one's really hard. I'll just go do a 5-minute search on LinkedIn of like people that I know or just people from my network and say, hey, just so you know, like this person might be interested, right? And just send that along with like a thank you. And I can't tell you how many times people are like, oh, like, clearly this person actually understands what I'm looking for, right, in the long run. And I think that's got to be more next steps than a lot of the actual interviews have, right? Because again, it's the average is pretty similar, right? And just being that one step above and showing you can actually do that thing or you actually have that interest is huge.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And like you said, that's the difference between hiring and not. So
yeah. Anyways. Great. Well, I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thanks for doing this. This is a lot of fun. I'm glad I got to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything you want to plug or mention? I know Coyote seems like your team's not hiring, but probably the company as a whole.
Oh yeah, there's tons of positions available over. I believe we got them posted on LinkedIn, as well as on our HR or on Coyote.com. And the good news is that no matter what job you work there, hey, you get to work with me in some way, and we try to make it fun and interesting. And I can guarantee logistics is a lot more interesting than you'd think it is.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun. It's really cool. We get to do some amazing stuff. And you just get to play with some really cool toys now, especially in the cloud. So if you want to come and have fun and work at a great place but I've loved working at for the past year and a half, check us out.
And Coyote is some historical. Chicago is probably the logistics capital of at least the U.S., right? And then Coyote in particular has kind of some history that goes all the way from Mr. Silver back to American Backhaulers, which is some legacy stuff. So my first client in recruiting and my last client in recruiting was a logistics company. So I have way too much logistics knowledge in my head that
it's a very interesting realm. In the logistics world in Chicago, it's huge. You don't realize how big it really is. And you're like, whoa, this is like a foundation of a lot of businesses here. And it's like you drive by some of them, you're like, oh, that's what I didn't realize who that is.
Next thing you know, you start recognizing every truck on the road. You're like, oh, I know that. You can't get away, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, but again, thanks again for this. It's been a lot of fun to do, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what your show comes out with, and looking forward to how you develop as a software developer as well. I'm excited for you especially because you seem to have that attitude and that potential that I wish more people did.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the kind words. And on that note, I'll get back to working on the the Google Maps problem I've been stuck on all day. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcasting app at The Professional Technical Interviewee. I want to thank my guest and my wonderful editor and producer, Dustin Bays. If you're interested in sharing your technical interview advice and being on the show, please reach out at dorsetttaylordev@gmail.com. Until next time, keep practicing.